Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Ring gong. Oh, excuse me. Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club. I'm Mike Farrell, a partner at Baker & Hostetler. On behalf of Baker Hostetler, I'm very pleased to introduce the 2018 High School Debate Championship. Today's debate is the final round of the North Coast District of the National Speech and Debate Association. This event, along with the high school programming coordinated by the Youth Forum Council, comprises the significant and continuing commitment to the youth of our community by the City Club. With the support of community organizations and sponsors, the City Club makes it possible for 1,700 students to attend free forums every year. The two men debating this afternoon will engage in a Lincoln-Douglas-style debate, which emphasizes logic, ethical values, and philosophy. This style of debate, unsurprisingly, is named after the 1958 Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were Senate candidates, and their debates were focused primarily on the issue of slavery. On behalf of Baker & Hostetler, we're honored to support this annual tradition in memory of Pat Jordan. Pat was a partner at the firm when I started there. He was an outstanding debater himself. And here with us today are members of Pat's family, his wife Sharon, who I've known for quite a while. And as I said, I knew Pat and worked with him, and I can't think of a better way than this event to remember him. So thank you to the City Club, and thank you all for being here. And so let us begin. I'll now turn the program over to Sky Forrest Baker of Berea Mid-Park High, who will introduce the resolution and explain the format.
Thank you and good afternoon. On behalf of the National Speech and Debate Association's North Coast, aka Cleveland District, I would like to offer our sincerest thanks to the City Club of Cleveland for their continued support of high school debate and for graciously providing us with a forum for our championship debate. I would also like to express our immense gratitude to the law firm of Baker Hostetler for sponsoring today's debate in honor of their late partner, Patrick J. Jordan, a highly respected trial lawyer and former policy debater at St. Ignatius High School. Thank you so much to everyone at Baker Hostetler for giving such an educational and transformative activity a moment in the spotlight. Finally, on behalf of my fellow competitors in this room, as well as those not in attendance, I would like to thank all of the judges and coaches without whom our success, this championship, and the weekly tournaments throughout the course of the season would not be possible. Today we'll be watching a Lincoln-Douglas debate. This style of debate is centered on the same moral and human rights issues that Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln debated in the senatorial debates of 1858. The resolution that will be debated today reads, "Resolved, the United States ought to provide a universal basic income." Each debater will offer a value, something that he argues is the most important thing we, the audience, ought to consider. Then, each debater will offer a value criterion, or a metric used to determine said value. Finally, each debater will provide a series of contentions, arguments that explain the relationship between real-world applications and their philosophical value. First, the affirmative debater will have 6 minutes to present his constructive case, followed by a cross-examination from the negative. The negative will then have 7 minutes to present his constructive case, as well as discuss and rebut the arguments presented by the affirmative. The affirmative will then have an opportunity to cross-examine the negative. The debate will then proceed into a series of rebuttals. The affirmative has the advantage of speaking first and last, whereas the negative has the advantage of longer individual speech times and a first informal rebuttal. Both sides have an equal cumulative amount of speaking and cross-examination time, and each debater receives up to 4 minutes of preparation time, should he feel inclined to use it. Prep time must be requested by the debater whose turn it is to speak, and it does not need to be used all at once. Following the final rebuttals, the decision will be left to our panel of judges. Our judges today are Katie Furman, assistant coach at Brecksville Broadview Heights High School, Ryan Peoples, head coach at Berea Mid-Park High School, and Amy Hanauer, Executive Director of Policy Matters Ohio. Thank you for judging today. The two debaters sitting before you on stage are two incredibly talented individuals who qualified to the national tournament to be held in Florida this June. On the affirmative, Sebastian Williams, senior at Gilmour Academy, is coached by Miss Gay Janis. And on the negative, Isaiah Paik, a senior at University School, who is coached by Mr. Peter Paik and Mr. James Lewis. I will be the official timekeeper for this debate, and Hawkins School's Zaid Akris, himself a national qualifier, will answer questions on air during the debate. Congratulations to these individuals for not only being here today, but also for their success and accomplishments, both throughout this season and their respective debate careers. On behalf of everyone in this room, as well as those listening or watching from elsewhere, I wish you both the best of luck. Now, if the competitors and judges are ready, let the debate begin.
Is my opponent ready?
Yep.
And judges, you guys good? Let's begin. I affirm that the United States ought to provide a universal basic income. Because human beings are only unique through our capacity to choose, and we form governments to protect this capacity against intrusions by others, the value, or most important consideration in today's debate, is freedom. In order to evaluate freedom, we should use the value criterion of non-domination. This is the view of freedom created by Princeton professor Philip Pettit. To understand this, Pettit looks at the history of U.S. slavery. Now, imagine a slave with a non-violent master who rarely, if ever, imposed his will upon his slaves. Even though the slaves were not usually interfered with, we would not refer to them as free, insofar as the master had the power to control their choices. This is the idea of non-domination. Freedom requires that others can't control our lives for arbitrary reasons, not just that they choose not to. Researcher Sarah Florescu, when writing for the Romanian Review of Political Sciences and International Law, explains, quote, "Freedom as non-domination promotes the idea that each citizen is defended against arbitrary domination, which occurs, for example, in domestic violence or when the employee feels that he is threatened by his employer. Prefer this view of freedom as non-domination because freedom is meaningless if it can be taken away by others arbitrarily." My first contention is that a universal basic income protects workers. In the status quo, workers have little to no bargaining power to improve their conditions or raise wages for that matter, because employers know that their employees depend on their job to survive. This causes domination because workers are arbitrarily subject to the will of their employers because they have nothing to fall back on. Journalist David Floyd explains, quote, "The existing welfare model has often been criticized for creating perverse incentives. Welfare ensnares beneficiaries through means testing and work requirements, and needs to change. The employment trap keeps recipients from leaving a job, whatever treatment they receive, for fear of losing benefits. Bad employers therefore receive a subsidy in the form of a guaranteed pool of labor, with no leeway to negotiate for better pay or conditions. This means that a UBI is uniquely key to solving this problem. We protect workers from domination, as they no longer have to be subject to the will of their employer just to survive, as they always have a universal basic income to fall back on. This ensures that people are paid decent wages, working conditions improve, and bosses don't mistreat their employees. My second contention is that a universal basic income prevents human trafficking. The poor and marginalized are often the first to be victims of human trafficking, because they have very little economic leverage. Even in the US, according to the Global Slavery Index, there are an estimated 57,700 people in modern slavery in the United States. Furthermore, many of these people are trafficked into sex work, for example, because they have no other option and are forced to do so. John Danaher, professor at the Keele University School of Law, explains, quote, "Even in jurisdictions where there is considerable mainstreaming of sex work, prostitutes typically don't have access to the same employment rights or protections as other workers. Social stigmas and norms mean that sexual labor tends to not sit within the traditional framework of legal rights and protections. The result is that prostitutes face difficulties in protecting themselves. And this causes domination, as low socioeconomic standing means that those who are trafficked into sex work do not have the leverage or ability to demand better conditions or escape, and are therefore dominated by the people who functionally own them. Furthermore, status quo welfare programs do not solve this problem because they don't give power to those who aren't officially employed in the eyes of the law, like prostitutes, for example, or child workers. However, a universal basic income solves this problem and prevents domination by unconditionally giving every human being economic leverage, so people are no longer forced to sell their bodies. My third and final contention is that a universal basic income prevents intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence, or sometimes called domestic violence, occurs in a relationship when one partner has control over the other and can exert their will through violence. This is a form of domination, as even if the abusive partner sometimes allows the other partner to be free, they can also restrict their freedom whenever they want for whatever reason. Professor Philip Pettit furthers, quote, "Suppose you live in conditions where you depend financially on your partner. In such conditions, they are likely to control you. You would live under their control, almost straining to keep within their restrictions, unless there is an effective, financially viable alternative, such as that what a UBI would provide. Other protections might be available here, but none of these are likely to be equally effective. When one partner is dependent on the other to survive, they become subject to the will of the abusive partner, thus causing domination. Since abuse victims often flee with nothing but the clothes on their back, status quo welfare is insufficient, as people are scared of not being eligible for welfare programs or not being able to get them, so they stay in an abusive relationship because they do not have the economic leverage to leave. Furthermore, abusive partners oftentimes control the complex registration required for welfare programs, so that makes leaving even more difficult. Only through a universal basic income do we ensure that people have the economic leverage to leave an abusive relationship and thus prevent domination from occurring. At the end of the day, because a UBI prevents domination caused by abusive bosses, it prevents human trafficking and allows people to escape violent relationships and therefore promotes true freedom. For these reasons, I urge you to stand with me and affirm. Thank you.
All right. If everyone's ready for cross-examination,
I'm good.
judges, Sebastian?
Yep.
All right. Let's begin. So we can agree here that a universal basic income would go to everybody in society, correct?
Yes.
So-
or citizens of the United States.
Sure. So I agree that we should try to help people who are being sex trafficked. But why should we give a UBI to sex traffickers?
Right. So the argument I'm making here is that there might be, so people, whether they get a UBI or not, it's not a question of what they do. Rather, it's a question of the fact that everyone is human beings. Oftentimes, when you look at these situations, it's not as black and white as this person's a criminal, this person's not. Sex traffickers are awful people. And we need to make sure, however, they don't have the ability to get, or for example, to traffic somebody. Only a UBI allows that person to be saved.
You don't think that giving a sex trafficker $10,000 wouldn't facilitate their
The
crime?
problem, however, is that oftentimes in trying to determine who is the abuser and who's being abused is difficult. And that's the problem with status quo welfare. A lot of times the people who are being abused slip through the cracks, and the abuser sometimes will end up being the recipient of this benefit.
So the answer is to just pay abusers.
No, the argument here is that a UBI would better serve the needs of society by reducing human trafficking. Even if there's a few instances in which someone who's a bad person gets it, on net, I've shown that it's comparatively better than the status quo.
Okay, do you have any examples of a actual UBI actually reducing human trafficking?
There are litany of experiments around the world that show things like crime, for example, decrease.
Okay, but specifically about human trafficking, any examples?
I don't have a specific experiment to study that.
Do you have any examples of a UBI actually solving for spousal abuse?
No, I think there's a lot of scenarios in which violent crime has decreased.
Okay, but
so
do you have
yeah,
any...
I would say spousal abuse is a form of violent crime. So yeah, if you look at it, there's litany of experiments around the world that show this is the case.
Okay, so let's go back to the first question then. So we agree that a UBI goes to everybody.
Yes.
So why should, say, the wealthiest 5% deserve a UBI?
Because the wealthiest 5% end up paying that money back in taxes because of how our progressive tax system works. So even if they receive a tiny bit, as I've said before...
So then why should they get a $10,000 tax break?
They don't get a $10,000 tax break. The way progressive taxes work is that they end up paying a lot of that back in taxes. So basically what happens here is that $10,000 for a poor person who doesn't pay that much in taxes is a lot better than $10,000 to a really wealthy person who pays back most of it in taxes.
Okay, but a UBI UBI, we can agree, is a universal cash payment to every American.
I have explained why that is a good thing.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So why should say that 2.3 million convicted criminals in American prisons right now? Why do they get a UBI?
So first, I'd argue that a lot of these prisoners are in prison for nonviolent crimes, for example. They still have human rights,
Okay,
and we
but
shouldn't just treat them
insofar as the
differently.
state already takes care of all of their needs, providing them not only housing and food, but also education programs, why do they need more money?
Oftentimes, getting more money reduces recidivism rates. There's lots of experiments around the world that show, and in the U.S., that when you actually give people money after they get out of prison, they do something better with their
What about
lives.
people on death row
Death row, for example?
who aren't going to get out of prison?
I mean, if someone's about to die, for example, they should still have the same human rights as everyone else. I don't think in a society
Do you think a UBI is a human right?
Yeah, that's what the affirmative shows. It shows that on balance, we reduce the kind of domination that's bad for society.
Okay.
Isaiah Paik cross-examining Sebastian Williams from Gilmour Academy. You're listening to the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. And prep time is just beginning now. I'm Nick Castell, a reporter at IdeaStream. I'm here with Zaid Akris, a Hawkins senior. Could you explain to me what exactly are the two debaters really trying to do here?
So what you saw at the very beginning of Sebastian's constructive was he was establishing what's called the framework. So that constitutes a value and a value criterion. And so what Sebastian is saying is that from a moral standpoint, these are the most important things to be considered. So what each side is going to try and prove is that through the contentions, how they uphold their own frameworks better, and thus they uphold the societal norms of morality and justice better.
So in a debate, do the debaters need to get the judges to agree with them at the end of the day? Like personally believe that they are right?
I mean, so the way debate works in general is very few of these resolutions actually are, people have beliefs that are very set in stone. And so what you're going to end up seeing is maybe after one debate, you're more persuaded by one side, but then you change completely after another. And that's kind of the nature of debate, is it's trying to make you detach your personal beliefs from the actual round and evaluate the merits of the resolution based on the round itself.
So the judge is really trying to see who is making the best argument here.
Yeah, so even if the judge thinks maybe like last week I saw this television program saying how like the neg is really good, that's not relevant unless the neg actually makes those same arguments.
Well, so as someone who does debate, do you ever find yourself defending a position that you personally disagree with?
What actually happens to me more often is my position ends up changing altogether, because once you kind of get to argue in favor of both sides, you realize how the true answer oftentimes is somewhere in between. And so, yeah, I've had topics in the past where I thought that I would think that one side was clearly right, but then at the very end of 2 months, usually it's changing.
Well, what kind of preparation do you have to do to even understand what sort of arguments you need to make?
Yeah, so in addition to just basic knowledge of what the topic is asking, there's a lot of importance on what arguments you're going to present and preparing for the arguments your opponent might go for.
And we're about to return to the debate just now.
All right, for this speech, I will start by reading my constructive case and then rebutting my opponents. Is everybody ready? Yes. Sebastian? All right, let's begin. I negate the resolution. Resolve, the United States ought to provide a universal basic income. The value for the round shall be justice, defined as giving each their due, because we have no sense of right and wrong without some notion of dues. The best way to evaluate justice is through the value criterion of promoting societal welfare. Societal welfare is the overall well-being of society through the lenses of health, safety, order, and economics. We created the United States to promote our well-being, and therefore we are due well-being. Government fulfills this obligation by protecting rights, but also by providing benefits to help its citizens. Universal basic income is a cash transfer of an equal amount to all individuals in a country, as defined by the International Monetary Fund. Henceforth, I will refer to it as a UBI. My first contention is that our current social safety net is better than a UBI at promoting societal welfare. There are 3 reasons for this. First, it's targeted. The social safety net is the broad term for the many programs our government has created to help the disadvantaged, including Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, disability insurance, the Earned Income Tax Credit, food stamps, and unemployment compensation. These programs were created to meet specific needs in our society. Pell Grants cover poor college students. Unemployment insurance covers those who lose their jobs, and Medicaid covers all sorts of medical care. Targeted aid better meets specific needs, whereas a UBI would just hand out money regardless of need or benefit, meaning less goes to those who truly need help. Second, the social safety net is adaptable. According to thebalance.com, after the 2008 housing crash, 13.1 million Americans benefited from an extension of the time limit on unemployment benefits by 33 weeks. Or, after World War II, President Roosevelt created the GI Bill, which provided 7.8 million veterans with education and work training. In fact, the entire modern social safety net was created in response to the Great Depression. Clearly, targeted support can respond to specific crises and better solve them, something that a UBI cannot do. And finally, current welfare programs are effective. According to Robert Greenstein, president and founder of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, our current system is responsible for lifting tens of millions of Americans out of poverty each year, including millions of children. And so, because our social safety net is specific, adaptable, and effective, it is better than a proposed UBI at promoting societal welfare. My second contention is that a UBI would devastate our social safety net. We see this in two ways. First, economically. There's no way to get around the dollar figures. A livable $10,000 UBI to the over 300 million Americans would cost over $3 trillion. Compare this to, as nationalpriorities.org finds, the total U.S. federal budget in 2015 of $3.8 trillion. Clearly, a UBI would necessitate cutting current spending. The Congressional Budget Office explains that we spend $2.6 trillion on our current social safety net, both in large programs like Medicare and Social Security, and in smaller programs like the Earned Income Tax Credits. So much of this spending would certainly be cut. There's only so much money the government can tax or borrow, and even small spending cuts can be devastating. Our total Veterans Benefits program costs about $100 billion, but the Department of Veterans Affairs still saved 120,000 homeless veterans from homelessness in 2016. And second, politically. Even if we didn't cut funding for the social safety net, many would claim that a UBI would make it redundant. Many conservative economists like Milton Friedman advocated for an unconditional cash income replacing other targeted programs. And the American Enterprise Institute asserts that a UBI would only be acceptable if it was, quote, financed by getting rid of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, supplemental security income, housing subsidies, welfare for single women, and every other kind of welfare and social services program, end quote. In other words, elimination of the entire existing social safety net. This rhetoric makes it a political reality that providing a UBI would mean cutting holes in our social safety net and letting some people fall through. In conclusion, I want to help poor Americans as much as the affirmative. However, I know that the best way to help the poor more is to give more help to the poor. Now, on to Sebastian's case. On the framework of liberty and non-domination, 2 points here. Number one, those are not absolute goods. For example, if I want to use my freedom to hurt somebody else, like a sex trafficker or an abusive spouse, we ought to limit their freedom. But second, it doesn't cover all of government's obligations. If government just kept us free and didn't provide anything for our social welfare, then that would not be enough. We obligate our government to do more. What that means is my framework of justice and societal welfare better encompasses the scope of this round and of our governmental obligations. On my opponent's case, I want to start off by an observation against his case. So every time he lists a specific group of people and says we need a UBI to help that group, what he's really saying is we need to target that group with a program. He needs to show why we need to help every single person, why every single person needs this UBI. And until he does so, we should not have a universal basic income. On my opponent's specific case, on Contention 1, yes, I agree that some workers are being harmed, but he needs to show why we need to give money to the people who are harming those workers. Second, we can help these workers in the negative world as well through things like unemployment. And third, a UBI actually will drive down wages and workers' benefits in two key ways. First, according to Daniel Gilmour of Cambridge University, a UBI would mean that some workers can work for less, meaning that in order to stay competitive, other workers will also have to work for less, driving down all of everybody's wages. And second, economically, by injecting a lot of money into the pockets of consumers, we're just going to be increasing inflation, meaning that every single worker now has less buying power. Then on the second contention about preventing human trafficking. So again, he's advocating for giving money to human traffickers. Second, people who are human trafficked are often non-citizens or not registered, meaning that we wouldn't be able to provide them a UBI in the first place. But third, we can solve this problem by solving for poverty. Again, as he says, the cause of this problem is that people are poor and they have no other option. But remember that our current social safety net lifts tens of millions of people out of poverty every year. We can already solve through targeted programs. On Contention 3, my opponent says we can limit partner violence. So number one, this UBI money can be abused by the abusive partner. My opponent says that they're controlling all the finances. They control the welfare programs. So if a UBI were going into that household, the abusive spouse would take that money and use it to abuse the partner more. He's not solving for this problem. But additionally, we can solve these problems specifically with other programs, like the Women and Infants and Children program that's only there to help battered women leave their houses. We have a targeted program already in place to help these women. And finally, we need to look at an actual UBI. When a UBI was granted to the Seneca Nation, it not only increased crime, but also increased poverty. So in the real world, when we see UBI programs actually in place, they are ineffective and don't create justice. So for all these reasons, I negate. Thank you.
Are you ready? Right, so if everyone's good, let's begin. So you talk about societal welfare, right?
Yes.
So what's to prevent like the majority of society, people who hold a popular belief, from just abusing people they disagree with?
I mean, that's how democracy works. Like we divide
Right, but you talk about
majority.
just societal welfare. You
Sure.
say that's the ultimate goal of society.
Right.
So what if there's like minorities in society, for example, that society as a whole doesn't like? Doesn't your framework allow them to be persecuted?
Well,
'cause it's for the best of society.
Insofar as they're also part of society, their well-being is also important in societal well-being.
So how do we value competing forms of well-being then?
I would say that it's the government's job to look at aggregates. So we can look at these
Okay, so
different...
that goes back to the idea
So-
of what I said before. If a majority of people hold a certain belief, what's to prevent them from imposing that belief on a smaller group of people?
Okay, so that's why we that's why we create things like laws and rules, right? We create...
Right, so we want to make sure that people aren't arbitrarily hurting each other, for example.
Sure.
Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about your first contention when you talk about how it's the status quo is better. Why is this mutually exclusive?
So
Why can't we keep some status quo programs and have a UBI?
So that's my entire second contention. I tell you, not only would it be economically infeasible, it would be politically infeasible as well to have both programs.
Wait, I'm confused though, because you talk about how we're able to extend welfare when certain times of crises occur.
Sure.
So does that mean that politically we would just extend welfare to account for adding a UBI, for example?
No, because what you're advocating for is not extending welfare. It's suddenly creating $3 trillion every single year.
Yeah, people still pay taxes on that though, right? For example, the top 1% would pay more in taxes on their UBI than a poor person would, for example, right?
I mean, sure, I guess.
Okay,
but
so $3 trillion isn't
that's
actually
not
the actual cost.
So
it's not the net cost, is it?
the only way to resolve for this problem only through taxes would be if we taxed everybody $10,000, and at that point, they're not even getting anything.
Okay, that's not really how that works, but that's fine. Let's talk about your attack on my case. When you talk about how it's going to drive wages down, can you explain why this is the case? Because you just kind of say that people are going to work for less.
Sure. So if some people, like say a teenager who does not have to provide for their own housing or food, can work for less, then they will.
Well,
and because
whoa, I'm confused about that. If I can still make more money and I just can't have my employer abuse me, why would I just accept a lower wage?
Because like I am able to, and I could
that
then
doesn't
would
make any
make
sense.
me that would make
why
me,
would I voluntarily
Can I
choose
finish?
to work? Sure.
Yeah, that would make me a more competitive candidate for a job. If I tell you I can work for less money because I have this UBI now. But what that means is it will drive down wages for other workers who can't make that same sacrifice.
Yeah, but
that's the problem.
In the status quo, my question therefore then is with a UBI, if everyone gets it, then how are you going to have these price differentials? You said that, someone who doesn't have that leverage, but if everyone has a UBI, does that mean that the wage problem isn't
I
going to
agree,
occur?
everyone will have a UBI, but not everybody has the same economic needs. So if I'm a mother of 2 children, I still only get 1 UBI, which is not going to be enough to support me
Do the
and
children
my
not get a
family.
UBI? I thought you said everyone in the United States gets a
Okay,
UBI.
sure.
So children would also get that, okay?
All right, but they are not workers, so they still have less home income for the home.
All right, I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was Sebastian Williams from Gilmour Academy cross-examining Isaiah Paik, senior at University School. I'm Nick Castell from IdeaStream. I'm here with Zaid Akris of Hawkins School. This is the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland on 90.3. So when we hear political candidates debate or we see like TV pundits debate each other, usually when we try to judge, well, who won that debate, we look at like, well, who looked the best, who sounded the best, who had some good zingers.
Yeah.
How do you win this kind of debate?
I mean, there definitely is a component where it's important to be a good speaker, but in essence, what debate is supposed to be about is once the two sides have established the most important values for the round, it's all about who best uphold those. Because if you guys can both agree, for example, freedom or well-being is the most important thing, whoever proves they best uphold that, therefore, functionally wins the round.
So, like, what actually goes into making a good argument then?
So the argument's going to have 2 things to be successful. First of all, you have to warrant it and explain why it is true. But second of all, the impact is just as important, where you have to be able to explain, even if it's true, why does it matter?
So it seems like you've really got to do some research beforehand so you can cite studies or show real-world impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, do you have to go to the place of not just showing why something is right, but showing like that it would actually be feasible and would work, and sort of say politically whether this would happen?
It's there's kind of a gray area there, because ideally Lincoln Douglas debate as a debate on values is detached from sort of the practicality of things, but then when you actually explain the real world implications of these things, so if you can show that something is inevitable, that's a lot different than saying it won't actually happen. And so yes, there is a lot of debate about the politics, therefore, because if you can explain how the politics mean voting aff or neg make something else happen inevitably, then yes, that's definitely relevant to the round.
Well, so the way I understand it is that when you're doing debate, you often work with the same question or the same resolution for multiple weeks.
So it's 2 months in Lincoln Douglas debate, and then different debate events have varying lengths for the resolutions.
So our debaters have had this question before, and they've gone through a couple rounds of this already.
So this was a resolution for states the first weekend of March, and so we've had this topic for just under a month now. So this will only be the second time they're debating it at a tournament, but they have definitely had lots of rounds of practice on it at the actual state tournament.
I see. So you do get to get some practice in this and coming up with your arguments.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we are about to return to the debate just now.
All right, for a brief off-time roadmap, the order is going to be the affirmative case, then the negative case. Is everybody ready? That's good. Let's begin. Starting on my value of freedom, remember that the only reason why we value human beings is that we get to choose our own actions. We get to set our own ends. If I show that a UBI better promotes true freedom, then we can affirm. The value criterion of promoting non-domination is key, and my opponent really didn't address this. Remember that freedom requires that others can't control our lives for arbitrary reasons, not just that they choose not to. Always look to reducing domination as opposed to just reducing interference or promoting welfare, as freedom is meaningless. Human beings are meaningless if their freedom can be taken away at any time for whatever arbitrary reason. He says this isn't the absolute goal of the government, and he says, for example, in Crossix that that's why we have a democracy, but that proves our point entirely. A democracy prevents domination from occurring, so his very answer to my question proves that he also values non-domination. Second, he says that the purpose of a government is to promote societal welfare. Sure, societal welfare might be a good thing, but we need to have restraints on government actions to ensure that the minority of people can't be violated by the majority, a question my opponent really couldn't answer. Now let's go to this overview argument he made. He says I need to show why it's universal. Well, there are a few reasons for this. First, a universal right would better resist electoral pressure than a needs-based right, since it would benefit everyone, thus being more entrenched in society and being a better bulwark against domination. Couldn't be as easily taken away. Second, it would also mean that those who rely on a universal basic income don't have to assert their rights on the grounds of being a class apart, a different group of people. Since everyone gets it, people are no longer stigmatized. Let's go to my first contention, which is that a UBI helps workers because it gives them bargaining power to say no to bad bosses. He says that why would we give money to the abusers? But ultimately, even if some abusers get money, I've shown that a universal basic on balance will still help the poor, because oftentimes what happens is people slip through the cracks. Second, he says the status quo solves, but concedes the argument that people do not quit their jobs out of fear of losing unemployment benefits, which proves the fact that the status quo doesn't actually solve this problem. Second, he says a UBI drives down wages, but first, that's not true, because people can no longer be bought out by these ridiculous low wages because they always have leverage to fall back on. But second, there's going to be more demand in the market, and people are going to want to get more jobs, and they're going to innovate more because they have more money to spend. Finally, he says it causes inflation, but that's also not true. First, a UBI actually creates what are called economies of scale. When more people buy more things, that means it's cheaper to produce more items, which will overall drive prices down. Second, there will be more demand in the market, and the free market tells us anything, is that people will always want to offer the lowest price in order to get the most economic activity, which shows inflation won't happen. Second, look at human trafficking. There are 57,000 people in the United States, and only a UBI solves this problem because oftentimes the works they're trafficked into, they don't get welfare or they don't get welfare because of it. For example, prostitutes or child laborers. He says that we're giving money to traffickers, but I answered that earlier. Even if some bad people get it, overall it helps society. Second, he talks about non-citizens, but that's just not true. There's still thousands of people in the United States who are trafficked by citizens. Finally, he says the status quo solves, but I've answered that already. Welfare programs don't give money to people who are trafficked to these, for example, illegal jobs like prostitutes. Finally, on my third contention, a UBI helps victims of intimate partner violence because it's comparatively easier to get than other welfare programs. He says the money can be abused by their partners, but it's a question of leverage. Being able to leave a relationship is better if you have the money to leave. He says targeted programs don't solve, but I've shown that they're way too complicated and people fear losing benefits. Finally, he talks about the Seneca Nation, but there are many alternative causes in the Seneca Nation that actually cause poverty to rise. Now let's move to a negative case. So his entire first contention is that the status quo social safety net is good. I agree that's the case, but my argument is on a second contention, insofar as the fact they are not mutually exclusive. First, if you look at journalist Tarsha Golshan, it's actually extremely politically unpopular for people to cut programs like Social Security or Medicaid. So even if it was expensive, they wouldn't cut these programs. Second, there are many ways we could fund a UBI. For example, a land value tax would generate $1.7 trillion. A flat tax of 40% would be sufficient, and due to the way such a tax works in combination with a UBI, it would be a reduction in taxes for 80% of the population. Finally, the rich people ultimately pay more in taxes because of a progressive taxation system, but the $3 trillion isn't the actual cost, just a really bad estimate. Overall, it would only be around $500 billion if you counted how a progressive taxation system works. For the following reasons, please affirm.
Sebastian Williams, a senior at Gilmour Academy, debating with Isaiah Paik at University School about the question of universal basic income. This is the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland on 90.3. I'm Nick Castell from IdeaStream. I'm here with Zaid Akris of Hawkins School. So I understand that these tournaments, they happen every weekend and they start pretty early on Saturdays.
Yeah, I mean, especially considering the fact that a lot of these tournaments are throughout Cleveland and throughout Ohio, especially the bus ride there and the bus ride back takes up a lot of time too.
How is that?
I mean, I would say if it definitely is not a great time to wake up that early, but people still do it because debate's that important to them. And so I would say that is a testimony to how important debate is to a lot of kids.
And you're often spending like almost all day in these schools, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the vast majority of your Saturday. And even when you do get back, you're often way too exhausted to do anything else productive. So it definitely takes up your whole Saturday.
Well, what are these tournaments actually like? Do you have multiple rounds that you go through?
Yeah, so in Lincoln Douglas, for example, you'll have 4 rounds, 2 on each side. And so you'll have to debate both sides of the resolution at every given tournament, and you'll debate against all types of opponents, all types of judges.
Now, I think some people, when they think of like high school or college debate tournaments, they think about the event where people talk really, really fast. This is not that, right?
This is not that. High school debate does have that. It's called policy debate, but Lincoln Douglas debate in Ohio, at least, is not like that at all, no.
It's not like that. This is more about sort of taking a little bit more time.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, is there anything that you've got to do to stay up on like current events to make sure that you're sort of well informed enough to go into these debates?
Yeah, so a lot of debate arguments are going to have some connection to the real world, and thus the more informed you are of the real world, the more informed your arguments will be in turn. But I mean, a lot of Lincoln Douglas debate topics are very ongoing issues, so like gun control, free speech. These are things that aren't just right in the news today. They're things that have been in the news for a while.
Oh, that's interesting. So what other topics have you debated this year?
So, for example, this year we debated whether or not plea bargaining ought to be abolished. We've also debated if wealthy nations had moral obligations to give money to poor nations. And so the topics definitely have a connection to the current events, but they're a lot broader and more considering like morality in general as opposed to what's happening right now.
Now, when you go into these debates, are you allowed to like bring anything with you, your notes or anything like that?
Yeah, you can bring whatever you want pretty much, except for anybody else to help you.
Except for there's no lifelines.
Right, no lifelines.
All right, and we will be returning to the debate just now.
Okay, in this speech, I will begin on the affirmative side of the debate, then go over the negative, and then address some key voting issues for the round. So, if everyone's ready, Sebastian? All right, let's begin. On my opponent's framework, he tells you in his last speech that we need to be free. We need to have this liberty to set our own ends and live our best lives. And I agree, that's important. I'm not saying we shouldn't care about this, but what I am saying is 2 things. First of all, these freedoms are not unlimited. For example, if Sebastian wanted to use his liberty to abuse his spouse or sex traffic somebody, as he talks about in his case, that would be unjust and we would want to limit that. But more importantly, remember that government has other jobs. If our government just kept us free and provided us no benefits, we would say that's an insufficient and illegitimate government. We want government to do more. We want government to help the welfare of all of society, which is why we should look to my framework, which better encompasses all of government's obligations. But even if you don't buy that, recognize that the best way to solve for domination is to give people out of poverty, and only our current social safety net program does actually get people out of poverty. He has yet to show you a single example of a single universal basic income ever getting anybody out of poverty. Now let's move on down his case. On the observation that I gave you, he says that we're going to solve for this stigma. So number one, speakers have come up on this podium before, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and told you that this stigma is not caused by just receiving welfare. It's caused by things like racism and prejudice, which won't be solved by giving a universal basic income. But number two, the way we can start to solve these stigmas is actually by pulling people out of poverty. But the point remains, there's no reason to give a UBI to everybody. He has yet to show you why we need to give this to everybody. On my opponent's first contention, he says that people are slipping through the cracks, which is an argument for more targeted programs to help those people, not everybody else. But then my opponent says that inflation won't occur. So just looking at basic economic theory, if you put more money into the pockets of consumers and people who will increase demand, but you don't give them programs like work training, which are programs of targeted welfare, we're going to increase demand but not increase supply, meaning that prices will go up and inflation will happen, leading to devastating consequences for the people he's trying to help. On the second contention, my opponent says that even if some bad people get it, we're helping society. But recognize what I told you. Number one, these people who are sex trafficked are often undocumented, meaning it's very difficult to actually provide them with a UBI. And second, he's going to be giving money to the sex traffickers as well. So he's not going to actually be solving for this problem in society. On contention 3, my opponent talks about how it's a question of leverage. But again, he misses my 2 points here. Number one, a UBI could be abused by the abuser. If Sebastian is abusing his spouse, he controls all the finances. So he will also receive the UBI and he could use that against his spouse. But then also, I tell you, we can solve these programs with targeted means, like the Women, Infants, and Children program, which is just instituted to help women escape from abusive families. But then I give you the example of the Seneca Nation. This is really important because what we see there is after a UBI was implemented, poverty went up 6%. Because of the UBI, because the people who received it did not know how to spend it, and the aid was not targeted to actually meet specific needs. So what we can see here is we're going to actually see harms when we affirm. On my side of the flow, my opponent did not address almost my entire case. So number one, on contention 1, my opponent says that they're not mutually exclusive, but he drops the real argument here. What I'm telling you here is that even if we can have both, the current social safety net is better. Because it's targeted. It meets specific needs. It's also adaptable. We can change it and adapt it based on the current crises that America is facing. And finally, it actually is proven to work. The most important evidence in this case is when I tell you that our current social safety net pulls tens of millions of people out of poverty every year. That's huge because my opponent has yet to show you any kind of number for how many people a UBI would save. On contention 2, my opponent says we can find many ways to pay for this. So number 1, he says that the cost would end up being about $500 billion. So even if we cut $500 billion from our social spending programs, that could be the entirety of Veterans Affairs, for example, which is currently lifting, again, 123,000 people out of poverty or out of homelessness every year. But even so, my opponent can try to come up with these new tax plans, but recognize that a UBI, no matter how you slice it, will be about $3 trillion. He can't just make that money up out of nowhere. But second, on this point about policy, my opponent says that it's unpopular to talk about cutting welfare programs in the status quo. Yes, that's true. But when people propose a UBI, they often propose a UBI as an alternative, and they do so because it would be politically unpopular to have both things. So it makes sense that even if we have the money to do it financially, it wouldn't make sense politically to have both things. Meaning that if we have a UBI, if we affirm, it will lead to cuts to welfare. And because welfare actually works, that's the hugest impact in this round. Looking at the key voting issues, the first thing is going to be that the social safety net is more effective at promoting societal welfare than a UBI. Again, the 3 reasons I gave you in my case went completely unaddressed. It's more targeted. Yes, a UBI would go to everybody, but that means it would go to people who don't need it, don't deserve it, or wouldn't do anything good with it. A targeted program goes to women who are escaping battering families. It goes to people who are poor or unemployed or need medical assistance. That's what we want. Second, it's also much more adaptable. My opponent has a constant UBI will not be able to meet the fluctuations of the American population and American societal welfare. But finally, our current program is extremely effective. Remember, tens of millions out of poverty every year versus however many Sebastian's going to talk about in his next speech. Then second, we need to look at the fact that a UBI would actually destroy the social safety network for 2 clear reasons. Number 1, I tell you already that economically it's unfeasible to have both. But number 2, the point goes all the way across the flow that politically it would also be unfeasible. But finally, even if we can have both, it still makes sense to invest all of our money into the safety net program because it's targeted, it's effective, and it works. At the end of the day, he needs to show, number 1, why we should get rid of programs that are currently lifting millions out of poverty every year because of their targetedness and their effectiveness. And second, why we should give money to people who don't deserve it and don't need it why that's the best way to help people who do. So because I want to help the poor, and the way to help the poor is to actually help the poor, I negate. Thank you.
That was Isaiah Paik at University School, and we'll soon hear from Sebastian Williams at Gilmour Academy at the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Nick Castell from IdeaStream. I'm here with Zaid Akris of Hawkins School. So as we get toward the end of the debate here, what are debaters trying to do? They've made their points, they've done cross-examination. How are they trying to sort of seal the deal here with judges?
Yeah, so at this point, it's clear what arguments you've made in favor of your side, and so what you want to do towards the end of your final speech is kind of summarize the arguments you think that you're winning and that are most important, and kind of crystallize those arguments to show how at the end of the day, these are the most important arguments, and they're the ones that I'm winning, so vote for me for that reason.
When you're in the middle of doing a debate, do you ever get a sense of, like, if it's going to go well for you or not? Can you get a sense from the judges how they feel?
I mean, some judges are very enthusiastic to let you know how it's going. Most judges are pretty good about keeping a straight face, and I mean, most of the time when the rounds are so close, you can't really tell how it's going to work out until the very end when you've actually read the judges' ballots and read their decision-making process. But yeah, I mean, definitely, if a round isn't going well, you can usually know deep inside, but at the same time, when a round does go well, you have that confidence.
But then sometimes you're surprised, too, when you get those judges'
yeah,
papers
sometimes
back.
you might not have realized that you had won a specific argument and that the judge actually picked it up better than you did, which can be a pleasant surprise.
Well, so seeing these judges' comments, have you found them to be pretty helpful for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the judges are always very eager to give a lot of constructive feedback so you know how best to improve for the next time. And oftentimes, next time I have this judge, what do they want me to do better? So I can focus on that the next time the judge judges me.
Well, where do you see yourself taking these skills that you've gained doing debate? I mean, do you see them being used elsewhere outside of sort of the debate circuit?
Yeah, I think like public speaking and rhetoric skills in general apply to no matter what field you want to go into, they'll definitely be very useful. So I think that's very unique about debate is no matter what you want to do, it's definitely going to help you later in your future.
And now we will return to the debate.
So for a brief off-time roadmap, it's just going to be a few key reasons why, at the end of the day, affirming is the best option. So is everybody ready? Let's begin. So the entirety of my opponent's last speech was basically predicated on the idea that if we have a UBI, we will have to cut status quo welfare programs. What that means is that all of his arguments, the last 6 minutes of what my opponent said, are contingent upon him showing that welfare and a UBI are mutually exclusive. If I'm able to demonstrate there are at least some benefits to a UBI, and that we can have both programs, then we can affirm. So knowing that, let's do our first key voting issue, which is the AF uniquely solves for problems in the status quo welfare systems. First, remember that people oftentimes take ridiculously low wages because they fear losing unemployment benefits if they quit their job. This argument was conceded and shows that even if we have status quo welfare programs, people aren't going to quit their jobs because they know that they might lose their benefits. He says that wages are going to rise, but has never answered the argument that people can no longer be bought out for ridiculously low wages because they always have something to fall back on, which is a UBI. Additionally, he talks about inflation, but conceded all of the arguments about how on balance it creates economies of scale, where manufacturing things becomes cheaper and companies want to offer the lowest price. The next argument here as to why a UBI is uniquely key is it helps human trafficking. He says most of these people are undocumented immigrants, but that's not true, as 57,000 people in the United States are trafficked and are put into jobs they don't want to do. He says status quo welfare solves this, but also conceded the fact, for example, if you're trafficked into being a prostitute, you cannot get welfare because you're not officially employed or officially looking for a job. That proves another example of how a UBI solves for problems in the status quo. Finally, on intimate partner violence, remember that sure, there might be violence when it comes to how to handle the money if you get with a UBI, but that is so much better than the status quo, because in the status quo, only one partner controls the welfare registration, but an individualized UBI allows people to have the economic leverage to flee an abusive relationship. Finally, he talks about the Seneca Nation, but remember that there were many alternative factors that led to this rise in poverty. They're not whatsoever correlated. But even so, the second key voting issue in this round, and the biggest one, is that we can do both welfare and a UBI. He conceded the fact that a land value tax would generate $1.7 trillion, enough to pay for a UBI. Insofar as the fact that since the rich pay more in taxes on their universal basic income, it actually knocks the price down to only $500 billion. A land value tax would easily cover that. He also conceded we could have a flat tax of 40%, which would actually be a reduction in taxes for 80% of the population because of the way it works with a UBI. What this means is that we're able to have the benefits of both worlds. He didn't do nearly enough work on his last speech, showing that status quo welfare programs and a UBI are mutually exclusive. But the final voting issue answers his question. Why should everyone get a UBI? Well, there are a few conceded reasons. The first is that a UBI is much less susceptible to electoral pressure. When everyone gets a basic income, the ruling class or the middle class can no longer say, hey, I don't want to pay for poor people. The fact that everyone gets it means that programs are much less likely to be cut. Second, people are no longer a class apart. The fact that everyone gets it proves his point entirely. People are no longer stigmatized for having welfare. Since everyone has it, we can ensure that everyone is on equal ground. Because only in the world of the affirmative do we promote non-domination and help society as a whole, do we actually promote true freedom and justice. For the following reasons, please affirm. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're at the end of an extraordinary debate. Can we get another round of applause for Sebastian Williams and Isaiah Paik? So there's some final scoring happening, some tabulations, and then some organizing that's going to happen. And we're going to do a Q&A right now. And just a reminder, if you're listening on the radio or joining us halfway through the stream on the television, this is the High School Debate Championship, the North Coast Division or the Cleveland Division of the National Debate Society. There's a room full of exceptional high school students. And we're going to go to audience questions. So Bliss Davis, my colleague, has a microphone in the back. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm going to start out by asking you both, what do you really think about UBI? Because you sort of had to take a side that you were more or less, that you chose, Isaiah, and you kind of got by default. But what do you really think? Is it a good idea or bad? He chose. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. I forgot. You chose. So Sebastian, what do you really think?
Should I stand up?
Yeah, stand up.
So I genuinely believe the argument that a UBI solves for cracks in the status quo welfare programs. I think that there's a lot of reasons as to why the welfare we have right now will often lead to people not wanting to quit an abusive job, for example, because they're scared they're not going to get benefits. I think we just make it a lot simpler while still having welfare. We're able to get the best of both worlds. That's an argument I genuinely believe.
That argument that you made at the very beginning, that it would free people up from employment that doesn't suit them or that is somehow abusive or anything. I mean, you went down the trafficking kind of rabbit hole there, but the general, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It was a solid argument, but the general idea that that a UBI would allow people more professional mobility is an argument that actually didn't get pursued very much in the debate between the two of you. Is that something if you could go do it over? Or is that, I don't know, I'm sort of curious. Did you expect that would be more of a point for this debate?
I think the argument kind of spoke to the idea that professional employment is more than just getting a career you want. It's also being able to escape dominating an abusive condition. So I thought we talked about that argument a lot. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot of different things to talk about with the UBI. We could have had a 3-day long debate about this if we really wanted to.
Okay. Sebastian Williams, thank you. Isaiah, you did defer to Sebastian, as you pointed out, as we were just determining the sides and doing the coin flip, which turned out not to be a coin flip on your part. Was that a little bit of sort of gaming the system, throwing a monkey wrench in, or just really authentically you're I don't care?
No, I mean, this is my last debate in Cleveland, in Ohio, and this is, of course, one of the best opponents I could have, and I wanted to have the best debate possible. So I said, Sebastian, you can pick the sides. And I was very happy because I actually do believe the negative. I think it's just economically unfeasible to have a UBI.
No, I'm going to push on this a little bit. So what if you could? I mean, some of the things that are happening right now, social impact bonds. You've looked at this kind of thing. I know. The idea that you could pay now less than it would cost down the road, right? So if you could find the money by knowing that with a UBI you would sort of have have to spend less money on housing for the homeless in the future or something like that. And then the homeless now having a home would need emergency medical services less often. If you could find the money that way, do you still believe that we shouldn't do UBI?
I mean, I feel like that's my whole argument, is that if we fund it by taking away current welfare programs, we're not going to actually solve for any of these problems. I think that we should help the poor. I think we should. But I think that we should help them specifically. And I think that UBI is unfeasible specifically because it goes to all these people who don't actually need anything.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. We look like we're getting very, very close here. So close. I wanted to congratulate you, by the way, Isaiah, on working into your comments the names of two former City Club speakers. I don't know. I know. I could see you sort of moving towards Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I don't know if you knew that Bob Greenstein spoke here last year. Oh, really? Yeah, he did. Yeah. So well done, you. I don't know if you get extra points for that, but the judging's already done, so it kind of doesn't matter. Are we ready? Do we have a winner? Mike Farrell, will you please come on up here and to read the names of the winner and our second place champion as well? Both are champions. Are we doing this? No, we're not doing it? Okay. Are we still live on the radio, by the way, Nick? We are. Okay. All right. Come on up, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome back Mike Farrell of Baker Hostetler.
Thanks. First things first, I think both of these gentlemen deserve another round of applause. And then without any further ado, the runner-up, 2018 City Club Debate Championship, Sebastian Williams. Congratulations. Well done. And I guess I don't actually have to say it, but first place goes to Isaiah Paik, 2018. Thank you. Well done.
Close it out. All right. Mike Farrell, thank you very much. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've really been enjoying the annual High School Debate Championship for the North Coast District of the National Speech and Debate Association. Our debaters were Isaiah Paik, a senior at University School, and Sebastian Williams, a senior at Gilmour Academy. The High School Debate Championship is sponsored by Baker Hostetler in memory of their former partner, Patrick J. Jordan. Patrick's wife, Sharon Sobel Jordan, is with us today. She's also a board member here at the City Club. We're grateful for your presence and that of your family as well. We also welcome students from so many local high schools. I'm not going to list them, and we thank all of you for being here today. That brings us to the end of our program, the end of the 2018 High School Debate Championship. You guys are amazing. Congratulations. You are all amazing people. Thank you for being a part of this. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.